You're listening to Edge of Faith, a multimedia magazine where we discuss art and culture through a Christian lens. So Albert, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So we're going to be talking about your book, Becoming an Ordinary Mystic. So I guess the first obvious and big question would be, what is an ordinary mystic?
Well, let me put it this way. The question might be to ask, why are mystics ordinary? Because in so many ways. Well, when I was growing up, I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, and when I grew up, while I was growing up, I used to have a statue of Mary, the mother of Jesus, in my bedroom. And every night when my mother would come in and put me to bed, she would turn off the light, and that statue would glow in the dark. And for so many years, I used to think, well, that's what mystics are. Mystics are those people who glow in the dark. You know, they're kind of the spiritual Marines or something of our Christian tradition. But the older I get and the more I realized it suddenly became evident to me that mystics simply do what we are all called to do. And that simply is, at every moment of my life, to respond to God's grace. And God's grace simply is his ardent longing and his enthusiastic invitation to come deeper and deeper into my life. And so really, the spiritual journey of any disciple is really a mystical journey, because mystics do what we are all called to do, and that is to respond to God's grace that God is constantly offering us in each and every moment of our lives. And so really the reality is mystics are a lot more ordinary than we oftentimes think.
Oh, that's a wonderful idea and way to think about it. Thank you. So maybe now would be a good time to just take a pause on mystics and maybe we can focus on Albert the mystic. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your spiritual journey?
So, I sometimes I think, as I think about it, I sometimes think I'm a little bit of an odd duck, because I still remember at the age of 13, when I was 13 years old, I really made the commitment to start praying every day. And I've been faithful. I'm 64 years old now. So for the past 51 years, I have established a regular habit and routine of daily prayer. And through my prayer, it kind of made me feel called to enter the Franciscan order. The Franciscan order is an order of men and women who live according to the rule of life that was written by St. Francis of Assisi in 1223. And so there's about 17,000 of us in the world, and we follow Jesus in the tradition and in the footsteps of Francis of Assisi, and that led me to ordination as a priest. And after I was ordained a Catholic priest, I spent about 8 years flying all over the country as an itinerant preacher. And then in 1991, the Franciscan order sent out a request asking for volunteers who would bring the Franciscan presence back to mainland China, because there were many missions in mainland China before Mao Zedong took over. And then once Mao Zedong won the war and basically established the People's Republic of China, all foreign missionaries were kicked out, and religion, of course, was suppressed. And then with Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, China began to open up. So in 1991, the head of the Franciscan order in Rome asked for volunteers to bring the Franciscan presence back to mainland China. So I responded to that request. I spent a year and a half on the island of Taiwan, which is an island off the east coast of China, where I studied the Chinese language and the culture, learned how to read, write, and speak Chinese. And then I went into mainland China. As a matter of fact, right now, because of this coronavirus going around the United States, I'm well aware that I was one of the first foreigners ever allowed to live in the town of Wuhan, which is the very place where this coronavirus got started. So I spent 9.5 years. I lived in Wuhan for 1 year, and then I moved up to the capital of Beijing. And then in 2003, in October of 2003, I was beginning to be followed by the Gong'anji, the Chinese security police, in the capital of Beijing. So that's when I knew my cover had been blown. So I made the decision to come back to the United States. I came back in 2004, and right away I spent 2 years teaching theology at our Franciscan University in Southern Illinois, Quincy University. And then I got back on the whole parish mission preaching gig. And so I spent a good 9 years, 9 years, about 46 weeks a year. I was flying somewhere to preach. I racked up 1.3 million frequent flyer points on United. And then just last year and a half ago, I was invited to become the chaplain at Cedarburg Catholic Retreat Center, which is the Catholic Retreat Center and Conference Center in the Diocese of Austin, Texas. And so that's where I am now.
That's wonderful. It sounds like you've had a good time and a focused, faithful life. That's awesome.
Oh, I am so lucky because, never in my when I was growing up in New Orleans, my mother used to always say, when I was growing up in New Orleans, I used to go in the backyard with a shovel, and I would start digging a hole. And my mother would come out and she would say, "Albert, what are you doing?" And I'd say, "I'm going to China. I'm going to China." Where that came from, I will never know. But, we used to always say, if you dig a hole straight down, you'll pop out in China. And so I always had this kind of fascination and interest in mainland China, but never in my wildest dreams did I ever think I would have the opportunity to live my childhood dream. And so I got to live my childhood dream for 11.5 years. So I consider myself really, really lucky and eternally grateful to God.
Absolutely. We all should. What was the inspiration to actually sit down and write Becoming an Ordinary Mystic?
Well, because I do a lot of, I'm a trained spiritual director, and I've been doing a lot of spiritual direction, especially in the past 10 years. I've even begun now to train spiritual directors. And one of the things that I've noticed time and time again is that I sometimes think that people are not aware of just how holy life is. And people are not aware that we are surrounded by the presence of God, Remember St. Paul when he was at the Areopagus in the Acts of the Apostle, he quoted a pagan poet. And Paul said, "In God we live, we move, we have our very being." So we're surrounded by God. It's as if God is like the air we breathe, and yet most of us are not aware of that. And I think part of the journey of becoming a disciple, and by virtue of that, part of the mystical journey, is learning to become aware of what we already have. I mean, we're sitting on this gold mine. We are living in the presence of God, and yet so many of us keep thinking that I have to go somewhere to get God. Well, in point of fact, I simply need to become aware of what I already have. Or, if I could say it in another way, Michael, you can put it this way, and that is to say that when it comes to the spiritual journey and when it comes to spiritual formation, there really is nothing to get because we already have it. Our challenge is to become aware of what we already have. And that's why I think, that there are so many books out now about how important it is to live in the present moment. But unfortunately, no one has really shown us from the Christian perspective why living in the present moment is a real spiritual practice for the Christian. And so I begin the book, Becoming an Ordinary Mystic, precisely with that, with how do we practice from a Christian perspective, how do we practice living in the present moment? And then from that, I kind of spin out how an entire format of spiritual formation and spiritual growth can occur simply by that simple practice of living in the present moment, being aware of the presence of God that surrounds us like the air we breathe.
Absolutely. That point of making what we already have, it kind of makes me think of C.S. Lewis when he talked about if we really saw what sinner and saint really was, that it would frighten us to death.
So true.
Absolutely.
So true. Yeah.
So that I guess what you just pointed out is probably a primary point, but I guess I still want to ask the question. What point or points in the book do you think are most critical for the EOF listener to take into heart or to apply in their everyday life?
Well, I one of the longest chapters in the book is a chapter that I call Jesus the Electrician. And in that chapter, I think, so oftentimes, depending on a person's faith tradition, depending on which Christian denomination they belong to, they're going to look at the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount in different ways. I open that chapter up highlighting how Catholics look at the Sermon on the Mount, how some Protestants look at the Sermon on the Mount, and even how our Jewish scholars look at the Sermon on the Mount. But I think the one thing we oftentimes forget, or maybe a lot of people just aren't aware of, is that the Sermon on the Mount is really, and especially the Beatitudes, and you find them in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount, which begins with the Beatitudes, really kind of, in a way, is Jesus trying to rewire our thinking. And so, for so many of us, we tend to think that, having the big house, the fancy car, and having lots of money in the bank, that is the secret to happiness. And Jesus says, no, wait a minute. Blessed are the poor. And, for those of us who are men, we tend to be control freaks. And we always want to be in charge. And we think that if we're in charge and if we have all the power, then we really are happy. And Jesus says, no, wait a minute. Blessed are the meek. And for people who are obsessed, with their reputations and what people think of them, Jesus says in the Beatitudes, blessed are you when they curse you and they call you all kinds of names. And so really what Jesus is doing in the Sermon on the Mount and in the Beatitudes is he's trying to rewire our thinking to a whole new outlook on what happiness is, and by extension of that, what the mystical life is all about. And so I think, so many of us, we go through life and we have what I call holes in the heart. It's the damage that occurred to us in our childhood. So what we lacked in our childhood, or what we think we lacked in our childhood, because perception is reality for each of us, what we lack in our childhood, or what we think we lacked in our childhood, in the adult becomes these ego obsessions. And what Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount, is he's basically trying to get us to take a look at what our ego obsessions are and then to replace them. And I think this is why, St. Paul will tell us to put on the mind of Christ, to let the word of Christ rewire how we understand life and how we understand happiness.
That's an awesome point. I mean, our egos, I guess, is our entire problem. That's what breaks us from communion with God and actually is sin, right?
Oh, I mean, when you think about it, all sin really is an expression of one or more of what I call in the book the 4 ego obsessions. And those 4 ego obsessions are my overinvestment in my self-image, in my self-preservation, in my self-gratification, and in my self-image. So self-image, self-gratification, self-preservation, and self-concern. And when you look at when we take a look at our sins, all of them, it's like people who are obsessed with their self-image, they're gonna always be struggling with those sins that kind of maintain their reputation. People who are obsessed with self-preservation are going to always struggle with those sins like greed, hoarding, that kind of thing, because I'm always afraid I'm not going to have enough. So those 4 ego obsessions really are, I like to tell people, they really are the great bugaboo in the spiritual life. And these are the things that we need to be working at. I think sometimes, sometimes we always want to blame the devil for our sins when in point of fact, so many of our sins are caused by our egos, and our investment in the ego. And so this is where the wisdom of the Sermon on the Mount, when you look at those 4 ego obsessions of self-concern, self-image, self-preservation, and self-gratification, and if you have those 4 ego obsessions in front of you, as you read through the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, you will see in each and every paragraph, Jesus is basically systematically challenging the ego obsessions. And
Absolutely.
I think that's something that we Christians just don't get. We just don't get it.
Yeah, hopefully with enough prayer, some of us will.
Yeah.
So I guess, we're coming close to the end. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, if there's one thing that I would love for your listeners, if your listeners could just begin to live with the awareness that there's nothing to get in the spiritual life, there's nothing to get in spiritual formation because they already have it. And if they could just learn to live with a deepening awareness of what they already have, which is the presence of God that surrounds us like the air we breathe. If I could just say this, Michael, real quick, it's written on every automobile, because on the passenger side rear view mirror, at the bottom of that mirror, it says objects in mirror are closer than they appear. Right. And I always like to tell people, scratch off that word objects and put God. God is closer than God appears. And I think as we grow in that insight, we really find ourselves being transformed into what I like to call ordinary mystics, people who live with this understanding and this awareness that at every moment of their life, God is offering them grace. And grace is simply God's ardent, longing, and enthusiastic invitation to come deeper and deeper into my life. And the question is, am I willing to open myself up each and every day to allow God's grace not only inside of me, but also to transform me?
Wonderful. Albert, thank you. That was a beautiful thought and beautiful. The whole book's beautiful. Hopefully more
thank you so
people,
much.
sure, hopefully lots of people pick it up and can focus on that spiritual side of their lives and become ordinary mystics or realize that they are. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you once again.
Okay, my pleasure, Michael, and thanks for all who listen to your podcast.